Okay, here's a little bit of a simpler question from Anthony Mash. Are there any Star Trek ships which have no historical parallels?
A Borg cube.
I was about to say the only thing I could think of would be a Borg cube, because even with like something like the Voth City ship,
Mm.
you can kind of say like various colony ships,
Yeah.
or that like colonize the Americas and so on and so forth. But I mean, equally, no one's. I say no one's no one's created a seaborne civilization, but modern cruise ships, you basically
Yeah.
are treading on a seafaring town.
Yeah, I mean, a modern cruise ship is probably like the modern equivalent of a Voth City ship. It is, as you say, it's basically a small town put to sea, and as long as it can pick up supplies, relatively self-sustaining. I think the only difference is with the Voth City ship, it just gets to a volume where it can actually self-sustain within itself. Although I deeply suspect they probably are still picking up supplies from various planets as and when they get there. But
Yeah, well,
it's
there's going to be ultimately things that aren't on your ship
mm, yeah.
because you only get in any kind of thing you build. You're only going to get out of it what you've put in.
Yeah, I think the only I'm just thinking on other scales, there's probably not an equivalent. There's not an equivalent, I think, of runabouts and shuttles. Because
Wow,
the idea of them as like orbit to surface transportation craft that has a parallel in ships' boats because harbour to port side or whatever, or ship to ship transfer. Um, but where the shuttlecraft start to depart from what we would think of as anything that comes around in real life is when you get people going off on like multi-day missions because shuttles are apparently warp capable, or at least a good chunk of them are. Um,
yeah,
and when you've got people like, oh yeah, well we went off like 2 or 3 sectors over in this little shuttle that we borrowed from the main ship, and now we're coming back to pick it up. That
yeah.
that's like someone going, here, give me the gig off of this battleship while we're sailing down in the Western Atlantic. I'm just going to pop over to like Tunisia. I'll be back again in a few weeks, and sailing off into the distance. It's like that's not how it works.
Come back.
Yeah, I suppose in the closest those things are these days are kind of maybe small private jets. So maybe like the carrier on board delivery craft for super carriers and stuff. But at that point, the small aircraft. But even that's stretching it because you don't see random officers just taking a C2 Greyhound and going, yeah, well, we're off to the other side of the ocean. See you guys. It's like
No,
half the command crew
yeah,
disappears off of a nuclear carrier to go and do something.
they don't just take a helicopter out so they can attend a conference on warp field dynamics or whatever.
Yeah, it's so yeah, the non-warp capable shuttles or the non-warp uses of shuttles have an analogy, but the warp capable usage of shuttles really doesn't. Um,
Yeah, it's an interesting. Ultimately, it's the storytelling device of we don't want to send all these characters to a place, or we
hmm,
want to find a way to separate these characters so that they can get kidnapped by Romulans
yeah,
or something.
without having to build the build or reuse a set for a smaller starship or something.
Yes, and
Which
then
to
explain
be
what happened to the rest of the starship.
yeah, and also at that point, this is it's the catch-22 for the storytelling device, isn't it? Because at that point you'd be like, well, okay, that raises a whole host of other issues, like who diverted an entire warp-capable starship to act as basically a space Uber.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you kind of get again closer to kind of small. I'm thinking like small yachts and things that can maybe like cross the Atlantic or whatever with stuff like the Condor or
Mm.
larger kind of runabouts.
Yeah, or the
But
Raven. Um,
yeah, but actual shuttles doing that kind of thing, yeah, that's completely.
yeah. Yeah, there's not too many things in Star Trek that don't have a real world analogy, but I think, to be honest, that's because a lot of the stuff in Star Trek is inspired by real world analogy because it makes it relatable. Um,
Yes, because we can understand it.
and then
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say that the shuttles are cars, and this makes a lot more sense if you're talking about like, because they're even like designed like cars or vans,
yeah,
especially the next generation ones, and it makes a lot more sense. Less so for us because we're
mm,
British,
yeah,
and theoretically we should be able to get anywhere within our small island within about a day
yeah.
driving. You don't.
No.
I will stress that.
Car Park
Uh,
25 can take an entire day to get round.
yeah. So there's that. But in America, multi-day trips are
Yeah,
definitely a thing, and you would take out the car for multiple days.
yeah, and I think, yeah, just going over it in my head, I think the only other thing where maybe there's not a necessarily an easy analogy ship design wise to a real world ship, well actually is not so much a thing that is in Star Trek that doesn't have a real world analogy. It's a thing that is in the real world that is actually, for at least for a naval or maritime aficionado, notable by its absence. Is large civilian merchant ships,
Yeah,
because you know in the sort of 1910s 1920s, the biggest ships in the world weren't battleships or battle cruisers or aircraft carriers, they were ocean liners.
yeah.
And in the modern era, there are ocean liner. There's, I mean, okay, fair enough. With the super carriers, annoyingly, um, they're kind of they're about the size, the displacement of the biggest ocean liners and cruise liners and so forth. But if the Americans didn't have the temerity to build the single largest aircraft carriers on the planet, ocean liners and cruise lines would still be bigger than any warship out there. Um,
Hmm.
and even with that said, there's a bunch of cargo container carrying ships and oil tankers and liquid natural gas tankers that massively outmass a nuclear carrier.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
where is the giant industrial civilian mercantile shipping in Star Trek? I mean, you see the occasional thing like Cassidy Yates's freighter,
That's
but
small.
it's titchy, or the Cardassian one that Golden Cat stuck a like planetary defense cannon on before he nicked a bird of prey. Um,
Yeah, there's the Grommo, and there's also a Klingon freighter, which is basically an upscaled version of that. It's
yeah,
literally the same model, painted green, and it can go
yes,
to about 500 meters.
yeah, but you don't you if you've got things like Vorcha, Dederadex, Galaxy floating around, you'd expect, if things were in scale, you'd expect to be seeing like at least sort of 1,000, 1,500 meter large cargo
Yeah.
vessels, bulk
The
cargo
only one
vessels,
I can,
passenger ships, etc.
the only one I can think of is that there's a larger version of. I'm just looking at this chart. The only thing that's kind of that size is the Malon freighter, which is about 730 meters.
Mm.
But even then, 730 meters, that's still smaller than a Dideridex and a Jem'Hadar battleship and various other things.
Yeah,
So it's still, yeah, there isn't really any kind of, yeah, super large cargo ships.
no. And when you think of okay, DS9 is a little bit weird because it's large but very spindly, so there's not actually a huge amount of internal volume to it. So something like Cassidy Yates's freighter probably could, in multiples, keep DS9 supplied, because
Mhm.
there's actually not that many people on it.
No, yes.
But then you take into account something like Space Dock 1 or Starbase 74, the upscaled galaxy swallowing
Giant.
one, and it's like,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but unless you've basically got a near constant stream of Cassidy Yates size freighters going in and out constantly, and unless that thing is like 90% empty space, which the number of windows would suggest it isn't, you are going to have huge issues keeping that thing resupplied. unless it's like just absorbing like a continent's worth of production from the planet below and just transporting it all up or something.
Yeah, which, well, in fairness, that is what Deep Space Nine did when it was built for the Cardassians.
Yes, well, that was just an oil processing refinery, and it wasn't exactly a particularly nice place to be.
No.
But yeah, and this is for the orbital facilities. You have places like Jupiter Station, in which you're not going to be beaming food up from Jupiter. Someone's got to rock up there with something that's going to resupply it, even if it's just with base matter for the replicators or spare parts for the power conduits or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of make the argument for the big stations like Space Dock 1 and Starbase 74 that they're big enough to have self-sustaining environments.
Yes.
But yeah, when you're talking about something like Jupiter Station, not so much. I was actually thinking this is speculative, but here's a size chart that includes a few ships, but includes the Malurian Dreadnought from Enterprise, which is sort of vaguely scaled at about 1,000 meters, an estimate. But the idea with that is that I kind of imagine that as a mobile ore processing factory ship, as to explain why it's so massive in the 22nd century when everything is so small.
Yeah.
The other potential candidate is the Sonar Collector. Because the Sonar Collector basically shows up in Insurrection, and no one's really suspicious of it.
Yes.
No one's like, what's this strange thing?
Gargantuan thing.
What's it doing here?
Yeah.
And it kind of makes sense if that is actually just a sonar freighter.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, when you're building these things, whether it's a space dock sized thing or like the the various smaller Federation star bases, most of which are just the regular space station from Wrath of Khan upside down or right way up or whatever.
Yes.
But these are fairly substantial structures. Somebody's got to be building those. You've got to bring the parts in from somewhere. Yes. And you're not going to be doing that with a bunch of tiny little 100, 200 meter long freighters. There's got to be some kind of bulk carrier out there somewhere.
Yes, that would be a very interesting design to see, actually. Something that hauls modular starbase pieces.
Yeah, and it makes sense from a logistics perspective as well, because if all you've got are these small merchant ships, it means that if you're then if let's say this starbase needs resupply, okay, you pack that thing to the gunnels, you can resupply that starbase. Now it's got to go all the way back to pick up the next lot and then go to the next starbase. That's even with warp drive, that's going to take a long time. Whereas if you've got a nice big bulk carrier, you can just stop off, pick up everything you need to resupply a dozen starbases, and then just go on a nice big long circuit. Which would also mean if you've got personnel that need to be shifted, people being put onto new assignments or just passengers going to and from places, a big combined cargo passenger hauler makes a lot more sense in the style of an old world ocean liner where you might have 4 or 5 different ports of call on its way to its final destination. And in some ways, the canon almost suggests the presence of these massive ships, even if you never see them, because if they didn't exist, if these massive combined cargo passenger ships do exist, it would explain why there seems to be so little space traffic, because it would all be concentrated on one ship, and if you don't happen to be in the same system when that ship arrives, it's going to be like space crickets.
Yeah.
And if they don't exist, if it's just these small 50, 100, 200 meter freighters, you'd expect it to look like a scene from Coruscant in like Star Wars.
Yeah. Well, what I would probably go with is like a tandem explanation. So what I'd say is you probably do have these giant bulk carriers. What happens is I'd say rather than probably servicing an individual star system, because in some star systems there isn't much. There's maybe a colony with like 1,000 people on a planet.
Yeah.
Who cares? What you would do is have those stop off at like major planets, homeworlds, stuff like that, or big colonies that are basically, you know, billions in population. You stop off at those planets, and then from there, people kind of will split off into those smaller, more localized cargo ships that are probably confined to that sector of space or that region.
Yeah, which is kind of what you see to a certain extent these days, but certainly a lot back in sort of the 18th, 19th, etc. centuries, when you have not particularly brilliant roads, the rail system's not so well developed, and you see people, yeah, they come in on an ocean-going vessel of some description, but if that comes into, let's say, Portsmouth, but they want to go to London or whatever, then you get a small coastal steamer that takes you to your final destination, where it's as you say, it might be a small destination, only a few people want to go there. So in some ways, I guess you'd almost look at it almost like the current airliner industry, which works very much on a hub and, you know, your big A380s and 747s and 777s wandering around the sky, transporting hundreds of people at a time. Then they land at the major hubs, and then, so like in the UK, Gatwick or Heathrow. But then if you were coming from the States and you want to go to, I don't know, Liverpool or Newcastle or somewhere like that, you usually can't get a direct flight from the USA, but you get a flight to Heathrow, and then you switch to a little I almost said ship, a little aircraft, a smaller aircraft, and, you know, a few dozen people aboard, or maybe even less, and that takes you to your final destination.
Yes. If you're being kind to yourself and you're not going to subject yourself to the train.
Yeah, it's cheaper to fly, to be honest.
Yeah, which is bizarre. That's the UK, but I think that's, well. So thank you, Anthony, for that question, because that's raised up just a whole load of old building that hasn't been done.
Yeah,
would actually be really cool to see. So next question is from Fracking Gaius Voltar. This is an interesting one. So if you were the head of Starfleet prior to the Dominion War, but you had foreknowledge of what was going to happen, you had the knowledge that the Dominion War is coming, what would you do in terms of building ambassador, or keeping ambassadors going, or building more nebulas? What would you would you keep the ambassador, or would you just get rid of, ditch it and just throw all your weight behind the nebula?
Okay, so if I'm going to use all the various bits of lore that I'm aware of, now I think it was I can't remember the name of the series, but it was one of the Next Generation book series that it was the USS Excalibur series.
Right.
I don't know if you've read that.
No.
Okay. So anyway, but I think it was within that book series. Could be another one. Anyway, it was basically, at one point it covered Bajor's first starship. First modern starship, I should say, because we know that the Solar Sailors. But basically, Bajor joined the Federation, and its shipyards are now producing its first kind of serious starship. And they're given the plans for the Ambassador class, because it's viewed, at least in that book, and this is kind of post DS9, as a relatively simple and easy ship to build, but big enough compared to, I guess, at that point, galaxies and sovereigns and stuff, but still big enough for Bajor to feel like, oh yeah, we've built something prestigious. I guess maybe it's got like the equivalent of like a Pentium 3 processor or something like that.
I was about to say, I don't know if you follow him, Triangulum Audio Studios, and he's done a lot more increasingly sort of beta canon, his own sort of head canon looks at various starships beyond their canon explanation. One of the things he came out with, the Ambassador class, which I kind of like, was that they were trying to run it on duotronic circuitry, i.e. the same circuitry from original series, And oddly enough, when running a ship of that size, the system just kind of crashes.
Yeah. And then, that's why we don't see as many of them.
Yeah, yeah, and also I just say, age, and
Yeah.
if you're sending ships like that out as explorers, which that's kind of the point of the ambassador class in its day. Given how many galaxy classes are destroyed in the next generation, what is it? Is there three?
Yamato, Odyssey,
Enterprise.
Enterprise, yeah. I think that's the three.
Yeah, I want to say there's another one, but I could be mistaking. But yeah, with if that's what the Galaxy class sort of suffered, then it's reasonable to assume that, again, particularly it's had a longer service life, a similar thing happened with the Ambassador, and again, that's partially why it's not as many. The dilemma I have for this question is, okay, you have the Ambassador. It's the top end heavy cruiser, as we've previously mentioned, but it's fundamentally it's too big to hang. Sorry, it's too small to hang with the real big, battleships or battle cruisers. It's not going to do well against them. It's also a bit too, depending on who you're fighting, it's also a bit too slow for handling a lot of smaller ships. That kind of depends. So Jem'Hadar fighters, no, not a chance. Matching it against a Galor, yeah, the Galor can't really get away. So you have this problem of it's kind of in between. The Nebula more sits on the side of it's very big, very heavy, not very agile, but has a ridiculous amount of firepower.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on which of the sort of the beta cannon stuff you go with. In my head, I would analyze it from a situation of, theoretically, as a kind of a galaxy era vessel, the Nebula is current generation, because you've got stuff like the Defiant and the Prometheus, but they're kind of their next generation. At the start of the Dominion War, they're not in full scale mass production, so it's the TNG era stuff is your current gen, and your Ambassador kind of your previous generation. So I think I would, if I'm faced with a choice between those two, I would look at it from a perspective of how many shipyards have I got, and what are their build capabilities? Because if my shipyards are generally capable of building all current gen stuff, for the most part, then yes, of course, building more Nebulas makes more sense. Stick a torpedo pod on top of the thing, and off it goes. And unless there's some radical sort of reason not to, like maybe, I don't know, with a Nebula with its a nacelle arrangement, if someone said, oh well, the Nebula is slow because of that, and the Ambassador with its sort of clear line of sight nacelles further away from the main hub, from the secondary hull, is somehow faster, then that's a different issue. But if I can spam a Nebula, then fine. I have my suspicions, though, assuming that we take the book about Bajor building things, that maybe they're in kind of like a World War II situation, where you have some shipyards in World War II that are capable of building full-size aircraft carriers and battleships, but you also have a lot of merchant shipyards that basically don't have a chance building a full-scale warship. But they can build smaller ships, and that's where you get things like the Flower-class corvettes, which are basically whale-catching ships, except reconfigured to have guns. And it doesn't require a huge amount of change in a merchant shipyard to just churn those out. And same with things like Liberty ships and Victory ships and some of the escort carriers, they're mercantile standard. So if that's the status, like where the most Federation shipyards are capable of building lower tech, but only the best of the Starfleet shipyards can build the latest tech, then I would be tempted to go, actually, you know what, if I've got a limited number of current gen shipyards, I'm gonna focus on building the galaxies, the war galaxies, to get the biggest bang for my buck out of it. Because let's face it, the amount of resources to get a Nebula versus the amount of resources to get a galaxy are fairly similar, and the galaxy is going to be the more capable vessel. And then my lesser shipyards would spam out ambassadors, and while they're gearing up for that, I'd quickly grab an ambassador off of the off of the line and go, right, we know how nasty we can make an Excelsior when we do a Lakota style refit. What's our Lakota style refit for the ambassador? Because let's face it, got a heck of a lot of hull volume. We can stick an awful lot of stuff in there. You know, and yeah, if we take, say, like you said with Triangulum, that it's trying to run on duotronic circuits. I go, okay, so how much is it going to cost us to rejig this thing with isolinear chips? You know, and so on and so forth. And then we can kind of issue that. It's kind of almost, it's not quite because it's at the upper end of the ship sizes, but it's almost like a flower class thing of, you know, all these lesser shipyards, the shipyards we haven't updated in 10 years, start building all your ambassador class hulls. We'll send some freighters around with the isolinear circuits and stuff to stick inside them, and the various other modernization elements to it. And that way we've got a bunch of ships coming off the production lines that, yeah, okay, they're not quite capable of going toe-to-toe with a Galaxy class, but who cares, because we've got a ton of them and they're almost as good.
Yes. I mean, actually, I'm just thinking, my kind of last remark on that is with... that is actually kind of the idea of different shipyards with different capabilities. Funnily enough, I don't know if you recall, in the some of the old Flash Trek games, where they would specifically have different shipyards. So you have your regular shipyards, which could build basically everything up to ambassadors, and then you would have the large shipyards, which would be building galaxies and nebulas. And you do actually have that kind of represented in the show, because you have that giant sort of crab-like shipyard,
yes,
which can hold a galaxy. And you know, I don't think a smaller style shipyard could.
Yeah, and to be honest, you given the sort of how a lot of Starfleet vessels work with the fact you've got the detachable saucer, and a lot of the time it's more just a, how do I say it? It's more of almost any Starfleet vessel can detach its saucer. The main argument is whether or not it can reattach it or not.
Yes.
On a given class basis. At that point, you could even have smaller shipyards and going, right, you build the engineering section. And because that's what will physically fit in your space dock or whatever, and you lot be building the warp pylons, and then these guys over here can build the saucer, and then you get some of the little worker bees, and you just kind of stick it together. And with the older stuff, when perhaps the sort of saucer ejection tech was kind of your one-off emergency stuff, it doesn't really matter because it's designed to break along that line, so it can be fitted together along that line. It's just that once it's fitted together, it doesn't come apart again until the end of the ship's life cycle.
Yeah, I think that explanation does actually kind of work, particularly in the sort of TOS era, where I don't imagine many planets would have, particularly like colonies, would have very robust shipyard facilities. Maybe they have a lot of resources that they can use to make the raw materials needed for ships.
Yeah, and I mean, I personally would, sort of getting away from just the Nebula Ambassador dichotomy, if I was preparing Starfleet for the Dominion War, I mean, yeah, my shipyards would be churning out the most modern, most capable ship designs I could possibly get my hands on within the scope of each shipyard's capability. But if anything, my major focus would be to start mass manufacturing in factories or whatever the component systems you need to refit older vessels, because let's face it, when we see the Defiant go after the Lakota, their initial reaction is, it's an Excelsior, like we're going to walk straight through it. and then the Lakota basically fights it to a standstill. So that's taken a huge jump in power, and that's okay. To be fair, both ships were a little bit holding back, and neither side was dropping quantum torpedoes on each other.
Yeah.
But if you can do that kind of lethality upgrade to your basic Excelsior, making additional quantum torpedo launchers, additional shield generators, additional isolinear circuits, etc. None of that really affects your ability to construct starships, unless there's a throttle in like how many circuits you can produce per year in a factory. But
and the advantage you have is they're already out there.
Yeah, and you bring those ships in, and every ship you bring in, slap a quick refit on it, it's now more lethal. You know, that might be the difference between a Miranda going toe-to-toe with a Jem'Hadar fighter, 50-50 win chance, and a Miranda coming back quite comfortably from facing off with a Jem'Hadar fighter, which then has a knock-on effect because they're down one ship and you're not.
Yes. And that can make a difference between maybe you're not going to be able to stop the Dominion with this fleet, but you will be able to slow it down.
Yeah, you're going
far better than otherwise.
Yeah, you're going to make them bleed for every step they take, rather than having to mass ships in a especially considering that the Federation's usually outnumbered. So if you're going to be outnumbered, you really want to have the maximum bang for each ship that you've got.
Yes, yeah, because you're never going to outbuild the Dominion. Right. That brings us to. I'm just jumping around the list because the next question would be quite extensive. So we'll go with a shorter question here, and there's quite an interesting one from Jay. Your favorite non-major power ship?
Oh, okay.
So that's an interesting one. It partially depends on what you define as a major power. So shall I say what my category would be? We'll give you time to think. So it's going a little bit outside the span of what we've been looking at. It depends on whether or not you consider them a major power, because one of my favorites would be the Tholian Tarantula class from Star Trek Online, which is this massive, great Tholian ship with like its own pre-spun webs, and it basically looks like a dune highliner, which kind of works for it. Like you can imagine it carrying all the little Tholian web spinners, and it's just a very striking and unique ship. Now that depends on whether or not you describe the Tholians as a major power. My other candidate would be probably the pirate ship from Unification, which is a modification of the one of the sort of generic beta models, where they put like some blades on it, and they're like meant to be like stealth blades, like anti-sensor blades, and it's got like visible gun turrets and things. It's just a very unique reworking of that model, and it left quite a good impression.
Yeah.
Or it's immediately blowing up.
Yes, that's true. Minor powers.
Because it partially does depend on definition, because
because I'm thinking like, how do the Xindi fare into all of this? Because at the time of Enterprise, they are a major power.
Well, I'd say they're a regional power, but that maybe this will be.
But everyone is a regional power at that point. It's like the Earth versus the Xindi is not okay. Admittedly, they've got Sphere Builder help, but the Earth versus the Xindi is not probably going to go Earth's way.
I'm just thinking. Like, Reptilian warship and NX are about equal.
Yeah. It's just I really like the big Xindi aquatic cruiser. Yeah, it's just whether or not it counts as a minor power ship. I mean, I'm kind of partial in some ways, just because of the eccentricity of some of the designs to some of the remastered TOS stuff. Like the Gorn ship from remastered TOS. It's not going to win that many aesthetic prizes, but it is very interesting.
Yes, it's extremely unique. I did a whole video about the various aesthetics of the Gorn,
Mm.
and in fact, I even missed a few. I think I missed the Starfleet Academy game, and then, of course, maybe even worse by the fact that the Strange New Worlds has come out and featured the Gorn, so
Yes.
it's even more out of date.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, that's a very interesting ship. It does it fit? It's all very flowy. It feels very aeronautic.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that would definitely be one. Like whenever you say favorite ships, every ship I'm coming up with, I'm going, no, that's actually from one of the bigger powers. I must admit, actually, I was somewhat partial to the Karema freighter.
Yeah.
It had it had a very nice design aesthetic, which I think the way I find ships that are interesting, at least to me, is if I look at them and I go, I can see how this might fit into like an entire species aesthetic, and I can you can almost start imagining how the rest of that species fleet looks based
Yes.
on the aesthetic. Whereas some ships, you look at it and go, okay, that's just clearly a one off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Kurama freighter. It's a very familiar look. I think that's the other thing. It's basically taking a you've got your rear section with the engines, a boom, and a sort of head,
Mm.
but it is doing it in its own unique way, and it's not doing it in the confrontational way the Klingons do it.
Mm. Yeah, I think the only other one that immediately comes to mind was from the minor powers that I would turn around and say actually that I quite liked them, but for very different reasons compared to all my other choices so far, would be in Year of Hell. The sort of the little coalition of, I think it's the Nahydron and the Mawasi that Voyager puts together towards the end. Those were actually some really nice looking, fairly well thought through ship designs that we only ever saw. I was seriously expecting to see them in more than one episode because it's like someone put a lot of thought into these.
Yes. Well, it's a funny thing with Voyager and then actually connecting it with Enterprise, because there's a lot of ships in Voyager that are reused in the background, either in the background of Enterprise or sometimes front and center
Yes.
of Enterprise. So, like the Flea ship is reused as the Romulan drone because it's sort of in Voyager when it's used for the first the who is it, the Acitrarians,
Yeah.
and then the Lokirum.
Yeah.
And in both those episodes, the model is given very fleeting shots, like it's not used all that much.
No, and then of course also you have in Enterprise the extremely long-lived Prometheus class and the resurrected NX-01 Dauntless in the fight with the Sphere Builders in the Enterprise J's timeline, which apart from anything, the only way to sort of, I guess, to justify their presence, weirdly enough, it's kind of retroactive in a way, is actually to look at things like Star Trek Online and Discovery. Because in Star Trek Online, we understand obviously it's done for just, people want certain ships in game without being wiped out in 2 seconds flat. But you have like original TOS flavor constitutions and the whole TOS era fleet wandering around.
Yeah.
And the kind of the justification is, well, the hull is just a shell, and inside we've just stuck it. It's basically a modern 25th century starship that we've just stuck an interesting aesthetic shell around.
Yes.
Because the captain wants it this way.
Yes. When I've worked with the Star Trek Online, the fourth combined fleet, and they're the ones who get me all the lovely screenshots of the game. I have brought up the idea of doing a strictly like a canon matchups where you actually would fit out your ship as best as possible to cannon armament and power levels. That's obviously up to a lot of interpretation. That's quite interesting. Equally, if you want that kind of thing, channel you can follow is Retro Badger Gaming. He has some fun videos on where he does it on Bridge Commander.
Oh yeah, I remember Bridge Commander.
Always quite fun.
And I think I think with the obviously with Discovery as well, you have this slightly weird thing. It was like 23rd century starships just gets refitted to be viable in the 29th century, whilst remaining looking roughly the same. So it's like, okay, clearly you can just gut the hull and replace all the systems at this point. So at that point, having the Prometheus and the Dauntless duking out with the Sphere Builders makes sense, because at that point, they're not the Prometheus or the Dauntless. They're basically, probably at that point, private yachts that somebody's just gone, I want a ship with this and this capability, but I want it to look like this.